Welcome to the Fahamu Focus podcast, where curiosity meets clarity.
Hello.
We take a stack of sources, could be articles, research papers, historical notes, you name it, and we really dig in to pull out the important stuff.
Yeah, the surprising facts, the hidden connections, the things that, cut through all the noise.
Think of it as your shortcut to being well-informed. We try to deliver it with, hopefully, just enough interest to keep you listening. We're always asking, where did this come from?
How does it really work?
And maybe, why do we still do it this way?
Exactly. And in each deep dive, we're here to guide you through the material you've shared, sort of highlight what jumps out as most important, connect the dots for you.
And hopefully leave you with a richer understanding than before.
Hopefully.
Today, we're looking at something many of you probably just celebrated, or at least thought about. It's a holiday that feels, really familiar, almost just there on the calendar. Father's Day.
Right.
So, today's deep dive. What do you know about Father's Day?
It's one of those days, isn't it? A lot of us mark it somehow, maybe a card, a phone call, perhaps buying a gift. Often, though, we don't really stop to think about its origins or the journey it took to get here. But as the sources you've gathered show, this particular holiday, well, it's surprisingly young, actually. And getting it nationally recognized, that was anything but easy.
Which honestly makes it perfect for one of our deep dives. Our mission today, using these sources you've provided, is to unpack the full story. And it's sometimes a bit dramatic.
It really is.
It's definitely younger than most people probably think, and it really had to, fight for its place on the calendar.
And this journey, it's not just, historical trivia. It's actually a fascinating window into how social values change over time.
Yeah.
How we perceive and celebrate family dynamics publicly. And it shows how even these seemingly simple holidays can carry, a really rich history, resistance, persistence, constant redefinition.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's unpack the story, starting right at the very beginning with the inspiration, the person behind it all. Because let's face it, a lot of people probably assume Father's Day was just cooked up by, Hallmark or someone trying to sell ties.
That is, very common assumption. And understandable, in our consumer culture today. But the actual start of Father's Day, as these sources detail really clearly, it wasn't rooted in commerce at all. It came from something much more personal. Gratitude. Recognition.
It all starts with one woman in Spokane, Washington, Sonora Smart Dodd. And this was back in 1909.
1909, yes. Sonora Smart Dodd was in church, apparently, listened to a sermon celebrating Mother's Day, which was itself still a relatively new idea back then.
Right.
And as she listened to this tribute to mothers, her thoughts immediately went to her own father.
And her father's story is absolutely key here, isn't it? This wasn't some, general idea about dads being great. It was very specific to her father, William Smart.
Exactly. William Smart, he was a Civil War veteran. But the detail that really struck his daughter, and the sources highlight this as the absolute catalyst, is that he was a widower. His wife had died in childbirth, and he took on the just immense responsibility of raising their 6 children, single-handedly.
6 kids, alone.
Yeah.
In that time period, post-Civil War, you just think about the sheer day-to-day effort, the sacrifice, not just providing food and shelter, but the nurturing, the guiding, the caring for half a dozen children as the only parent.
It's an extraordinary thing for any time, but especially then. The sources really paint a picture of dedication.
Absolutely.
And Sonora Smart Dodd, sitting there hearing about mothers, felt this powerful conviction that fathers like her own, fathers who showed that kind of unwavering dedication and love, they deserved a similar kind of public recognition and honor.
So her motivation was deeply personal. It was a direct response to her father's life, his heroism within their own family.
Precisely. It wasn't initially about gifts or, big commercial displays. It was about seeing that parental effort, that impact acknowledged, just like they were starting to do for mothers.
It highlights how emotional and sort of grassroots the whole thing was at the start.
It really did. It came straight from a daughter's heart, a feeling that her father's sacrifices shouldn't be overlooked just because motherhood was getting its day. It was a simple idea, really, but profound. Wanting to say thank you publicly and wanting that paternal role valued.
So she has this idea, sparked by her dad, sparked by the Mother's Day sermon, and she didn't just let it sit there, did she? She actually went out and promoted it.
She did. She took it to the Spokane Ministerial Association, the local YMCA. She actively campaigned for a day to honor fathers.
And it worked, at least locally, remember?
Yes, in Spokane. The very first Father's Day celebration happened there on June 19th, 1910. And they chose June, apparently, because her father, William Smart's birthday was in June. A nice personal touch.
June 19th, 1910, that's the date, the very first one. So what did it actually involve? According to the sources, what did that first Father's Day look like on the ground in Spokane?
Well, the sources describe things like church sermons focusing on fatherhood. People distributed roses, red ones for living fathers, white ones for those who had passed away, and congregations wore them.
Okay.
And there were various family tributes, within homes in the community. It was primarily a religious and civic kind of event, focused on acknowledging the role through reflection and public displays of respect.
So very much like the early Mother's Day customs, which also had those strong church ties and community recognition aspects. Definitely grassroots, locally driven, focused on honor, memory, not buying stuff.
Exactly. It was an organic response born from this really compelling personal story of a father's resilience, and it was trying to balance the recognition given to mothers, essentially giving fathers their based on what they contributed to the family.
Now, just think about that for a moment, you listening. The origin wasn't a marketing meeting. It was a daughter, Sonora Smart Dodd, feeling this deep need to honor her widowed father, William Smart, a man who showed incredible dedication raising 6 kids alone. What does that origin story, rooted in sacrifice and gratitude, tell you about the initial spirit of this holiday?
And maybe how does that compare to how you perceive it today? Where, let's be honest, the focus often seems to land squarely on finding the right gift, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It really reveals that at its core, Father's Day began as this heartfelt movement, a way to acknowledge the significant, often quiet contributions of fathers. A very different starting point from the commercial thing it eventually became. It started with acknowledging the why behind the role, not just the role itself.
Okay, so you've got this beautiful personal origin in Spokane, 1910, a local thing, born from gratitude, the idea is out there. Mother's Day, which became a national holiday in 1914, seemed to get traction relatively smoothly, right?
Comparatively, yes.
But Father's Day, the sources hammer this point home. It faced a long, long uphill battle to get national recognition. They even used that specific phrase, a 50-year struggle.
That phrase, a 50-year struggle, it really does capture it. While the idea of celebrating fathers did gain some popularity, and you saw local observances popping up here and there, getting it officially onto the federal calendar, that took decades. Decades of pushing and overcoming some pretty significant resistance.
And what's interesting is, it wasn't because nobody important liked the idea early on, was it?
No, that's one of the surprising things you find in the sources. Despite this long struggle, the idea actually had supporters in very high places quite early. President Woodrow Wilson, way back in 1916.
1916.
Yeah, he publicly endorsed Father's Day. He even apparently participated in a celebration in Spokane and tried to make it official during his visit there. He used telegraph signals to unfurl a flag remotely or something like that.
Wow, okay, so he tried to make it official back in 1916. That's only, 7 years after Sonora Dodd first proposed it?
Exactly. And he wasn't the only one. President Calvin Coolidge, he also supported the idea publicly in 1924, recommended states observe it.
So you've got presidential nods multiple times, decades before it actually becomes law. But the sources still say it remained unofficial for ages. This wasn't just paperwork getting lost. There was something deeper blocking it.
There really was. It wasn't just bureaucratic inertia.
So what was it? What do the sources pinpoint as the main reasons for this resistance, this decades-long delay?
This is where the story gets really insightful, I think, about the social norms of the time. The sources point directly, explicitly, to cultural attitudes toward masculinity as a major barrier.
Cultural attitudes toward masculinity. Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What does that mean in the context of resisting a holiday for fathers?
It suggests there was this societal discomfort, a prevailing view that public displays of sentimentality or overt emotional appreciation for men, especially in their role as fathers, just felt different than it did for mothers.
How so?
Well, mothers were traditionally seen, culturally speaking, as the emotional center of the family, right? The nurturers. So a holiday focused on sentimental tributes, flowers, cards, that felt kind of natural, aligned with expectations.
But fathers were perceived differently, more stoic, maybe.
Yeah, the sources imply that the dominant cultural image of fathers back then was more focused on their role as providers, as figures of authority. Perhaps, more stoic, less outwardly emotional.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of a public day dedicated to celebrating them with flowers and cards and, sentimental gestures, it maybe felt less conventional, a bit awkward, maybe even unnecessary to some people compared to how they viewed Mother's Day.
So it wasn't that people didn't love their dads, obviously. It was that expressing that appreciation publicly in this kind of designated sentimental way sort of rubbed up against how masculinity and fatherhood were culturally framed back then.
That seems to be the core of it. The sources mention specific criticisms, like some people argued Father's Day was overly commercial or that it somehow enforced traditional masculinity.
That overly commercial critique is fascinating because you said earlier it wasn't very commercial yet.
Exactly.
So that shows the fear of it becoming commercial was there right from the start. Maybe they saw it as, I don't know, crass compared to the supposedly pure sentiment of Mother's Day.
That could definitely be part of it. And the other critique about enforcing traditional masculinity, that really highlights the point about cultural attitudes.
Yeah.
Was there a worry that celebrating fathers publicly would just reinforce that narrow, stoic, provider-only image?
Instead of maybe acknowledging a fuller picture of what fatherhood could be.
Right. It begs the question, was society back then comfortable valuing fatherhood for its emotional side, its nurturing aspects? Or was it primarily valued for providing and protecting? It seems there was tension there.
It really paints a picture of a society kind of wrestling with how to show appreciation for fathers in a way that either fit or maybe even challenged the existing gender norms. This wasn't just people not caring. It sounds like active cultural friction.
Precisely. This resistance, rooted in these really deep-seated societal ideas about gender, emotion, public display, it was a huge hurdle, and proponents had to keep pushing against it. It's a fascinating look into the values of that era.
So, okay, if that was the resistance, how did things finally start to shift? What helped chip away at that? The sources mentioned something maybe a bit unexpected, World War II.
Yes, the war. It seems to have played a significant, though perhaps accidental, role in making public celebrations of Father's Day feel more normal, more acceptable. The sources state that World War II helped normalize public celebration due to patriotic themes.
How does a global conflict connect to celebrating dads? What's the link there?
Well, during the war, Father's Day started being used more and more in, public messaging and campaigns to honor the troops fighting overseas, many of whom were, of course, fathers.
Ah, okay, so it tied the holiday to patriotism.
Exactly. Celebrating fathers became linked with the supporting the war effort, boosting national morale, honoring the men, the fathers, sacrificing for the country.
That framing makes sense. It shifts it away from just individual sentimentality, which maybe felt awkward, towards something more like civic duty, national pride. That would have been much more palatable during wartime.
It gave it a context where publicly recognizing fathers felt less like being overly sentimental or commercial and more like showing support for servicemen and their families back home. That definitely helped wear down some of that earlier cultural resistance.
Okay, so you've got early presidential nods, decades of cultural resistance tied to masculinity and commercialism fears. Then WWII gives it a patriotic push. But even with all that, it still took a surprisingly long time to become official nationally.
It wasn't quick, even after the war. The idea kept gaining steam. More people celebrated it, but still unofficially. The push for actual federal recognition just continued, decade after decade.
So who finally got it across the finish line? What was the final push?
Well, the legislative efforts really picked up in the 1950s and 60s. Then, in 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson took a big step. He issued the first presidential proclamation that officially designated the third Sunday in June as Father's Day.
A proclamation. That sounds important, but it's not quite the same as a permanent law, is it?
No, exactly. It was more like an annual designation, a presidential call for observance. It didn't have the force of a permanent federal holiday established by Congress. Getting that final stamp took a few more years.
And which president finally signed the actual bill?
That was President Richard Nixon. In 1972, President Nixon signed the bill, making it a permanent national holiday in the United States.
1972. Okay, let's just pause on that. The very first local celebration in Spokane, 1910. Signed into permanent law, 1972. That is 62 years.
62 years.
62 years from Sonora Dodd's heartfelt idea to it being officially on the books. That 50-year struggle the sources mentioned, it was actually longer, over 6 decades.
It really highlights just how deep those cultural barriers must have been and how incredibly persistent people like Sonora Smart Dodd and those who carried the torch after her had to be. This wasn't a holiday that was just easily accepted. It was really hard won over generations.
So for you listening, just take a moment with that timeline. Why did it take that long? What does this decades-long fight, facing down resistance based on ideas about masculinity, about commercialism, What does that tell us about American society's values through the 20th century?
And what changes maybe in how we viewed fathers or families or even just public displays of emotion had to happen for that resistance to finally break down in 1972.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that holidays we see as just there often aren't static. They're forged in these cultural debates shaped by history, pushed forward by determined people.
They carry this incredible history of resistance, persistence, and redefinition, just like the sources say.
Okay, so Father's Day finally gets official national holiday status in 1972 after that unbelievable 62-year journey. And remember how those early critics were worried about it being overly commercial?
Mm-hmm.
Well, fast forward just a little bit, and that prediction definitely came true, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Despite the very personal, non-commercial start and despite those early worries, yeah, the holiday pretty quickly became a major player on the retail scene. The sources specifically note that Father's Day became a commercial force by the 1980s.
The 80s, so really within about a decade of becoming official, the marketing folks and the stores really latched onto it.
Yeah.
And it's only gotten bigger since then, right?
Substantially bigger. We've got some data here from the National Retail Federation cited in your sources that gives a sense of the economic scale. In 2023 alone, just in the U.S., spending for Father's Day hit about $22.9 billion.
$22.9 billion. That's a huge amount of money being spent every year for this one day. It definitely cements its place as a major retail event, up there with other big holidays.
No question. It's a significant boost for consumer spending in June. But the sources also point out something else that's really consistent and quite notable when you compare it to Mother's Day. They call it the spending gap.
Right. Despite that massive $22.9 billion figure, Father's Day spending year after year consistently trails behind Mother's Day spending. The sources estimate the difference is somewhere around 30–40% less.
Yeah, this spending gap shows up reliably in consumer data for these two holidays. The sources call it a persistent disparity in consumer behavior, and it's definitely worth digging into based on the information we have.
Okay, so just looking at the data and thinking about the history we just discussed, that long struggle, the different cultural feelings about celebrating moms versus dads, what might this ongoing disparity suggest? Why do you think we spend less?
Well, the sources don't offer one single definitive answer, but we can certainly analyze it based on what they provide. It can still be linked, perhaps subtly, to those older cultural attitudes we talked about. Like, even though Father's Day is fully accepted now, is there still a kind of cultural conditioning, maybe unconscious, about how we express appreciation through gifts from mothers versus fathers? Is the expectation or pressure different?
Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's just about the kinds of gifts that are typically bought. Are Mother's Day gifts just generally more expensive, or do people buy more of them?
That's definitely a possibility. The sources list the common gift categories for Father's Day, things like tech, tools, clothing, food, and leisure items.
Okay, so yeah, gadgets, stuff from the hardware store, shirts, maybe grilling equipment, or experiences like game tickets or golf.
Exactly. Often practical things, or the things tied to hobbies, leisure activities. Now, without detailed price comparisons from these sources, it's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly plausible that the average cost, or maybe the sheer number of gifts given, might differ from typical Mother's Day gifts. You know, things often associated with moms like jewelry, spa treatments, flower bouquets, which can add up.
So the spending gap could be this mix of things. Maybe lingering echoes of older cultural norms about expressing sentiment towards men, and just the practical reality of the types of gifts that have become traditional for Father's Day.
It's fascinating that even after becoming such a huge commercial success, this difference from Mother's Day just persists year after year.
Yeah.
It suggests that commercialization doesn't just wipe the slate clean, culturally speaking.
Yeah.
The way we spend money on Father's Day seems to still reflect, at least partly, some of those historical ideas about fatherhood and how we show appreciation for men.
And how has this whole commercial side, this multi-billion-dollar industry around Father's Day, how has that shaped how we see the holiday today?
Well, arguably, it shifted the public focus quite a bit. Remember, the origins were about deep personal honor, public recognition of sacrifice. But the modern experience for many people revolves pretty heavily around, picking out that gift, the consumer aspect.
Right.
Does the focus on buying tools or tech gadgets maybe inadvertently reinforce a more traditional image? The father as the practical guy, the provider.
Or, like you suggested, maybe it just reflects that those are the interests people associate with the father figures in their lives, and it's not necessarily tied to older gender roles anymore. The sources don't really give us a final verdict on the societal impact of the commercial side,
No, so they don't judge it.
but the sheer scale of it and that spending gap, those are clear facts from the data.
It's just another layer in how the holiday has evolved. It shows how outside forces, like the retail market, can really shape how a day is perceived and celebrated. And sometimes that creates a bit of tension with its original, more sentimental roots, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The holiday is undeniably a commercial giant now, but one with these distinct characteristics that still hint at its unique and sometimes conflicted history.
Okay, so we've traced Father's Day from its very personal beginnings through that decades-long fight for recognition, which was all tied up in cultural norms, and into its current status as this major commercial holiday. But the story's still unfolding, isn't it? And maybe the most important shift, the most contemporary one, is happening right now. A real redefinition of who exactly we're celebrating on this day.
This is such a crucial point that comes through in the sources. It really reflects how much family structures and societal values are changing. The whole concept of the father being honored by this holiday is expanding quite significantly.
It's moving way beyond just, the biological dad.
Oh, absolutely. The sources talk about a clear move towards an inclusive definition. They state the holiday now honors a wide range of father figures.
And who gets included in that wider circle, according to the sources?
Well, the list they provide is pretty comprehensive. Biological dads, of course, but also stepdads, adoptive dads, mentors, grandfathers, and even single mothers.
Wow, even single mothers, including single mothers, really says something powerful, doesn't it? It acknowledges the reality that in so many families, that role, the father figure role, providing responsibility, guidance, support, is actually carried out solely by a mom.
It represents a really conscious effort to broaden the holiday's meaning. It's not strictly about biological paternity anymore. It's about recognizing the individuals who step up and fill that nurturing, protective, supportive role in someone's life.
It's acknowledging the importance of, chosen family, too, the people who provide that paternal kind of guidance and care, even if they don't fit the traditional label.
Exactly. And this expansion of who we honor seems directly linked to a deeper shift in values that the sources also point out.
Ah, okay. How so?
But the whole cultural conversation around fatherhood itself is evolving. It's moving, as the sources put it, from traditional masculinity toward emotional presence, chosen family, and quality time.
That feels like a really critical development. It signals a change in what we're actually prioritizing and celebrating in that father figure role. It's not just about those older, maybe more rigid ideals anymore.
Precisely. The emphasis is shifting more and more towards the father figure's active involvement.
Yeah.
Right? Their emotional availability,
Yeah.
their willingness to connect on a deeper level, and the value placed on spending meaningful time together.
Rather than just being the financial provider or the disciplinarian.
Right. It's a shift towards valuing the quality of the relationship, the emotional support that's offered, recognizing that those aspects are just as vital, maybe even more so than older definitions that centered purely on provision or stoicism.
The sources mention some core values of fatherhood that are coming to the forefront in this new definition. What were they again?
They list them as responsibility, presence, protection, and emotional availability.
Okay, so responsibility and protection, those feel pretty traditional, right? But adding presence, meaning actually being there, involved, tuned in, and especially emotional availability, that really highlights this contemporary focus on the emotional side of fathering.
And the great thing about those values, responsibility, presence, protection, emotional availability, is that they can absolutely be embodied by any of the individuals on that inclusive list.
Right.
A biological father, yes, of course, but also a stepdad who provides that consistent presence and emotional support, or a grandfather offering wisdom and guidance, a mentor shaping a young person's future, or, yes, a single mother embodying all aspects of that parental role.
And this is where this evolution really connects directly with you, the listener, doesn't it? How does this wider, more inclusive idea of who counts as a father figure and what values we're celebrating shifting towards connection, presence, how does that resonate with the diverse families and relationships you see around you? Or maybe you're a part of yourself. It makes the holiday feel much more relevant to more people's actual lives today.
It acknowledges that reality, doesn't it? That families are beautifully complex and varied, and that the supportive, guiding role we traditionally associate with fatherhood is filled by many different kinds of amazing people.
And this redefinition, it doesn't seem like it's finished. It feels like an ongoing process. The sources even look ahead a bit, speculating about future possibilities for the holiday itself.
They do. Some interesting ideas get mentioned, things like potentially renaming the holiday entirely, maybe to something like Father Figures Day,
Hmm.
or maybe just adopting more inclusive renaming generally to explicitly signal that broader scope.
Father Figures Day seems like a pretty logical extension of where things are already heading, making it explicitly about the role, not just the biological link.
It does. And then there's the most maybe forward-looking suggestion mentioned, the idea of potential post-gender interpretations of the role.
Post-gender interpretations. Okay, that pushes the boundaries even further. What might that actually look like?
Well, it suggests a future where maybe the holiday evolves to celebrate the qualities and the functions we traditionally associate with fatherhood. Protection, provision, in a wider sense than just money, guidance, emotional presence, but celebrate them regardless of the gender of the person showing those qualities.
Interesting.
It taps into those broader societal conversations happening right now about gender roles, about parenting, about what really matters in raising and supporting people.
That really drives home the point that Father's Day isn't some static, unchanging tradition carved in stone. It's this dynamic thing, constantly being shaped by how society changes, how families change, how our understanding of gender and parenting evolves.
It's still a living reflection of our times, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows how the holiday keeps adapting, trying to stay relevant and meaningful in a world that looks incredibly different from Spokane back in 1910.
So there you have it. A deep dive into the, well, surprisingly complicated story of Father's Day. It started not as some marketing ploy, but as this really personal tribute back in 1910. Sonora Smart Dodd, honoring her amazing father, William Smart, a widower, a Civil War vet who raised 6 kids all by himself.
And then this heartfelt idea hit a wall. It faced this incredible decades-long struggle against cultural resistance, all tangled up in ideas about masculinity and fears of it becoming too commercial. A fight that lasted, incredibly, 62 years before President Nixon finally made it a permanent national holiday in 1972.
And along that journey, yes, it absolutely did become a huge commercial event. We're talking billions of dollars spent now, though interestingly, still with that persistent spending gap compared to Mother's Day, which maybe hints at some lingering cultural echoes or just different gift-giving habits.
And perhaps most importantly, for where we are now and where we might be going, the holiday is really undergoing this profound redefinition. It's becoming a much more inclusive celebration, honoring a whole range of father figures. And the values being celebrated are shifting, too, towards emotional presence, quality time, chosen family, moving beyond some of those older, more rigid ideas of masculinity.
This whole journey really demonstrates what we aim to explore at the start of this deep dive. Father's Day is definitely younger than many people think, and watching its evolution gives us this powerful insight into how social values and family dynamics evolve over time.
It really does bring clarity to something that might have seemed simple or familiar on the surface. It shows that holidays are, as the sources put it, rarely as simple as they seem. They carry the history of resistance, persistence, and redefinition. It's a perfect example of where curiosity meets clarity.
So as you think about Father's Day, maybe next year, or reflecting on this year, consider that remarkable history, that struggle, that adaptation. Given where it's come from a daughter's personal plea against the cultural grain, to this evolving, more inclusive idea, how might Father's Day continue to change in the future? As families keep diversifying, as our ideas about gender and parenting keep shifting.
And maybe that sparks another thought for you. What other holidays, what other everyday traditions do we just take for granted? Might they also have similarly complex, maybe even hidden histories, stories of resistance, redefinition, unexpected journeys just waiting for us to uncover?